So we're going to look at a different tradition now, rhetoric. And one of the most famous names in rhetoric is Kenneth Burke. There's a little sketch of him. And he is very well known, and a lot of people in the field of communication just love this guy, and for good reason. He's one of the most influential voices in the area of rhetoric. And since rhetoric is one of the oldest areas of research, and Burke is one of the most well-known names and the biggest influences in that area, he's really an influence on the entire field of communication. He came up with this concept, or clarified this concept, called identification. And he says that when people are speaking in a rhetorical situation, they will often try to increase the overlap between how the speaker and the audience see themselves. So if you imagine two circles overlapping, the rhetorician's job, the speaker's job, is to increase that overlap so that they see themselves as the same. And there are three main ways that Kenneth Burke said that people do this. The first is by emphasizing the common ground between the speaker and the audience. And so oftentimes, especially in introductory remarks, speakers will, especially accomplished speakers, professional speakers, and many times politicians, they will emphasize what they share in common with the people who are listening. Quite literally. If they're speaking to a bunch of blue-collar workers in a steel mill, my guess is that politician is going to emphasize how they have some working class roots as well. We are the same, right? Just like you. I grew up through hard work, and my father worked in the coal mines. They're going to, whatever parallel they can draw. Another way is through antithesis or opposite. Sometimes people call this the common enemy. Sports coaches are unbelievably good at these three things. And one of the ways that we do it, sports coaches rather do it, is through the rival. If you can figure out who the rival is, who your nemesis is, that team that you always get extra fired up to play against, then you have a better sense for who you are. In other words, every time the Bills play the Patriots, there's an extra special level of motivation. And even though we might not have, the very best team at that season to play against them, it binds us a little closer together because we're defining ourselves against who we are not. We are not the common enemy. We are not the antithesis. We're not opposite of ourselves. We are a team. We are together. Politicians do this. Lots of professional speakers do this, and certainly football teams do this. Basketball teams do this. I can remember back when I was in high school. Every time we played the next town over, very often it's a town close by. Next town over, boy, everybody really wanted to beat that town, and we even knew the record, right? For the last 10 times we've met, we've beat them 4 times. They beat us 6, so we really have to get even. We might not know the record against every single team, but you know it against that rival. And it helps you feel in your group more bound together. Politicians do this again by pointing at different countries or different groups that are the enemy. Especially in political season, of course, the other people, the antithesis is the other party. And the assumed we is where we use words that are we. We use that plural term, we, our, us. And that shows that, again, from a word choice standpoint, that you, the speaker, is included in the group. I know that one of the most common phrases that presidents begin almost all their speeches with is fellow Americans. And now that's a use, in a way, a use of the assumed we. You're using that plural term, fellow Americans, like, hey, I am a citizen just like you. And that is a very pleasant way for presidents to start their remarks because it shows commonality. And so Burke is well known for this, as well as some other things, but these three identification messages are very common when you hear speakers speak to crowds. Another thing Burke is famous for is this concept called guilt. He didn't invent guilt. It's in quotes because he means it a little differently than other people mean it. But he says that guilt is the main motivation for our communication. That's a big claim. And here this dog is looking a little guilty. You may have seen videos and pictures online of of different dogs who have done something bad, and the owners might have other dog next to that dog, and they look normal, but then you get to the guilty dog, the one who ripped up the couch, and they have this look on their face. And so Burke's definition of guilt is not exactly like this. It's not like you clearly did something wrong and you should feel guilty about it. Burke says that the word guilt is a overarching term he uses to describe any feelings of tension, inadequacy, not measuring up in some way, any kind of distance between how we want to be and how we are, and we're recognizing our inability to get there. And so what we do is, with communication, we attempt to fill that void. We speak out of that place of guilt. And maybe you did do something wrong. The word guilt certainly could still count for doing something wrong. But we try to bridge that gap with our words, with our rhetoric. So oftentimes you'll hear people speak, and even in conversation, and they're talking really about where they want to be, what they're hoping for, not necessarily where they are, and that they're content with that. They're almost always speaking out of this place of discontentment, this place of guilt. And Burke says the sources of guilt are at least these three. The first one is the negative. And in other words, we're always breaking some rule. There's a whole bunch of rules that you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that, and we're always breaking some kind of societal rule, some kind of policy. You can try as hard as you can, but you might just even break them by accident. And like you might be speeding and not realize it until you see the speed limit sign. But seems like we're always breaking some kind of rule. We're always defining things, our lives, against what we are not. And we recognize full well that we are not perfect. That we're not at the word perfection yet, but we're not living up to those rules perfectly. We are well aware that you've even heard people say things like this. Well, it's not that I'm jealous, or it's not that I'm, angry about it. And you think about it, it's like, wow, you're really talking a lot about how jealous and how angry you are. That's another example, I think, of the negatives. Like, you realize that you are jealous and that you are angry, and so you're trying to smooth that over with your words. So the source of that communication is your guilt. Perfection is another one, and this is a concept of perfection. Perfection really doesn't exist if you think about it in this world, at least. But the idea of perfection is that we have a concept of perfection in our heads, of what things could look like perfectly, and we measure ourselves up against that perfection. So a very clear example of this is the difficulty that a lot of women have when they look at magazine covers, because we don't measure up really to the magazine cover. And if you think about it, it's a little bit ridiculous that we even try, because we all know, especially now with the internet, and you get to see how these processes are done, but there are teams of people, hairstylists, makeup artists, lighting people, and they they make the model look even better than they really look. And then once they have a great photograph, then they bring it into the computer and start photoshopping or whatever. And some of the before and afters on these things are really amazing. And this notion of perfection is just impossible to live up to. But for example, I know some females, for example, that'll say it makes them feel terrible when they look at magazine covers. Well, that terrible feeling is what Burke would describe as guilt. In other words, we see a concept in our minds of perfection here on this magazine cover, and we know that we don't meet it. And by the way, the models themselves who pose for these things know that they don't meet it. When you see interviews with them, many of them will talk about how they don't really look like that, and that it takes a whole lot of effort to get them to look like that, and they wish they look like that, but they don't. That's just an image, and there's a lot of work that goes into that. Guys have a similar thing. It might not for some guys it might be about looks, and for other guys it might not be. Same for not all females really care about magazine covers. It doesn't bother them to notice it. It doesn't affect them in any way. But I've talked to a lot of guys, for example, and they feel like maybe they're not strong enough, or maybe they don't make enough money, or they don't have certain kinds of skills. And so we watch athletes and things, and yes, sometimes that inspires us, but very often we feel jealous, or we wish we could be there and we're not. And so this concept of perfection that we carry on our heads really is powerful, and it becomes the source of a lot of our communication. A lot of what we say comes out of a place of guilt. Hierarchy is the third one, and that's where no matter what position you're in, whether you're an intern or you're all the way up to President of the United States, you are on some rung, on some kind of hierarchical ladder. And wherever you are on that ladder, there's always someone a little above you, and a little above them, and a little above them. And by the way, even if you're at what other people would say is the top rung of the ladder, people still have weird feelings of hierarchical guilt at the very top, because they think that they might lose their place, and they get concerned about losing their place. And so you're stuck in this middle management position. There are people below you, people above you, and you kind of know where you are, and you know your place in the world, but it doesn't feel very good. And out of that comes a place of guilt. So people looking for promotions, they're trying to change their job title to sound more fancy, and that's an example of hierarchy. We're trying to move to better neighborhoods. We're trying to go to better schools, and that's all about that guilt, how it's one of the main motivations for what we say and what we do. Guilt is a cycle, according to Burke. Here's a little cycle image and a picture of Rocky from the first Rocky movie, the one that won the Academy Award. I highly recommend the first Rocky movie. Just watch the first one. If you've never watched Rocky, it's just called Rocky. Rent it, stream it, whatever, because it really is outstanding. And just pretend that the other Rocky movies didn't exist, and you will see this guilt cycle in perfect form. In fact, most of the great stories, whether, and I'll just use examples that you might know, things like Star Wars, things like Lord of the Rings, all of these movies, the Avengers, they all follow the guilt cycle. And that is that Burke says this guilt cycle, all the great stories, all the great rhetoric, we follow this pollution, purification, redemption cycle. So pollution is the state of guilt. There's something wrong. We're not measuring up. For Rocky in this movie, he was a bum. The guy who ran the gym, Mick, who became his trainer, called him a bum. You're just a bum. You're just a thumb breaker. Rocky, in the beginning of this first movie, used to collect money for a low-level organized crime figure, and when the people didn't pay the money, he would break their thumbs. He would beat them up because he was a tough guy. And he was told that, you could have been an amazing boxer, you had talent, but you wasted it. See, pollution. Pollution in other movies like Lord of the Rings is the ring represents this evil. There's evil in the world. The world is polluted, and it needs to be cleaned out and purified. In Star Wars, of course, the dark side of the Force is pollution, and there's guilt there. Things are upside down, and the Emperor and Darth Vader, they represent this pollution. And then there's the purification stage. Purification stage is where we try to get rid of that guilt through some kind of... Every story, every rhetorical event is a little different. But for example, Rocky, you see them figuring out, hey, wait a minute, I can do this. I can train really hard, and I can try to fight the champ. And that would be a way to get rid of this guilt, right? I can exercise extra hard. I can run up those stairs. I can do as many sit-ups as I can and push-ups to that music. And that's this. They show the process. They show the character starting to overcome. In Lord of the Rings, they show the journey, right? Trying to get that ring so they can throw it into the mountain, the volcano mountain, and destroy it once and for all to purify the world of that pollution. We see this all the time, and of course Star Wars is really clear about it. They're trying to overcome the dark side, to conquer the evil empire. They're just like so clear about it. And to do that, he trains to be a Jedi. Luke Skywalker, I'm talking about the movies of Luke Skywalker. He's training to become a Jedi with Yoda. He's unlearning everything he's learned. He's trying to connect with the good side of the Force and reject the dark side. And then there's redemption. And the redemption in this guilt cycle is not permanent. It's a cycle. People oftentimes cycle right back to pollution. But you'll see at the end of these stories, they try to leave you in a place where everything has finally come together in the way it should. So the example in Star Wars, of course, is the Emperor is thrown into some kind of void and some energy field and dies. So the evil is destroyed. Sorry if I'm ruining these movies. This is a spoiler alert. At the end of the Lord of the Rings, and I won't tell you how, but the ring does get destroyed, and evil is gone from Middle Earth. And Rocky, his challenge is a little different. He actually did not go into the fight thinking he was going to beat the champion. The champion is Apollo Creed. He was modeled after Muhammad Ali, and really it was not realistic to think that he was going to win this fight, but he was given the chance because he was a local fighter, and the guy who was scheduled to fight got injured in training camp, and so they found a substitute who was on a short time frame to get ready for this fight. So Rocky tells his then girlfriend Adrian the night before, you can hear the guilt, he says, Adrian, I can't beat this guy. You know, this is in his stinky apartment the night before. He says, I can't beat this guy. As she says, well, what are you going to do? And he says, well, you know, it doesn't matter. He said, it doesn't matter if I beat him. It doesn't matter if he opens my heads up. He opens up my head. He said, nobody's ever gone the distance with Creed. And at the end of the fight, if that bell rings and I'm still standing, if I can just go the distance, I'll know for the first time in my life that in the way he says it is, I'll know the first time in my life that I weren't just another bum from the neighborhood. And you can see there the guilt in his rhetoric, right? In his messages. Pollution, purification, redemption. If he can stand at the end of that fight, he'll be redeemed. Now, he doesn't have to win. He doesn't have to beat Apollo. And really, there's no way to beat Apollo. If you've seen the movie, it's just not going to happen. But he figures out his own way to victory and his own way to redemption. And by the way, in all these sequels and all the movies that come after these, all the great stories, they go right back into pollution. It's a cycle. So Rocky 2, they follow him, and it opens up where he's all bashed to pieces in the hospital. He's lost part of his vision, and now look, he's beat up again, right? He's not in that state of redemption anymore, not for very long anyway. And now he's got to fight his way out of that brokenness to become a great fighter again. So there's Kenneth Burke, and he's just absolutely amazing, and this is why so many people in the field of communication love him. This guilt cycle and identification explains so much about not just regular world communication day to day in terms of, you know, the people out there, but our own lives. You can see these moments where we're talking in this way and we're trying to overcome and we're trying to get to that place where we feel that redemption. And by the way, here's a little footnote. These words, redemption, guilt, purification, etc., have a religious connotation. And Burke, you know, at times it was criticized on this. People said, well, why are you using these religious terms? And he said, well, because they're the best words. They're the best words to describe what people go through. He wasn't a particularly religious man as far as I know, but he said, why should I swap out words when the people that have looked at these things, for example, religious philosophers and things like that, already have the best words to describe what we see in our rhetoric, what we see in our stories, what we see in our great speeches. And so the field of communication is not one that shies away from religious terminology or faith, and it's not necessarily one that gravitates toward it either. It sort of has a neutral stance on it. And the next one is the narrative paradigm. This is also rhetorical theory, about how we form messages and how we evaluate. Especially this one is about how we evaluate messages. And so narratives or stories are another way that we think rationally about claims and evidence. In a court of law, for example, we hear stories, right? We do hear evidence, and we do have a rational capability to think. But most jurors, for example, are not trained. So we're listening to stories. One lawyer has a story and the other lawyer has a story. This approach of listening to stories and evaluating them is contrasted with the rational, argumentative view of most rhetorical approaches. So that classical look at rhetoric, ethos, pathos, logos, and Aristotle, and how we make arguments is very important. But the narrative paradigm says, well, most people are not trained in rhetoric. Most people are not actual attorneys or know how to evaluate evidence really. And yet, we still, throughout society, throughout the world, are able to listen to what people say and we evaluate it. We judge it whether or not we believe it and whether or not we're going to agree with it or whether or not we're going to reject it. And Walter Fisher said that storytelling is universal and it's a natural human activity across time and culture. In other words, all cultures do it. Throughout history, we tell stories. It's one of the things that defines us as human. We're storytellers. So if we're not looking at ethos, pathos, logos, then how are we evaluating our stories? Well, Walt Fisher says through probability and fidelity. And probability is the coherence or how a story hangs together. Does it sound like it makes it unfolded in a probable way? Does it hold together? Is there an overall thread of coherence that goes through the story? Or in contrast, is there some kind of weird gap or missing piece that doesn't quite make sense? And so we think, wait a minute, something's missing. I don't know if I buy that. I don't know if I believe that story because something's missing. You may have said that in your mind when you're listening to someone explain what happened. Maybe they're trying to tell you a story about what happened and you're not convinced, right? Fidelity is another concept, and that's to what extent does what we're hearing, the story we're telling, ring true? Fidelity. Does it ring true with what we already accept as true? Does it ring true with human nature and the stories we've heard about that? Does it resonate, in other words, with what we already accept as a normal reality? So here's an illustration. Now, it happened in a court of law, and so we're not really going to talk about the evidence and ethos, pathos, logos, but just about the two different stories, overall stories the attorneys told. There is a young mom named Casey Anthony, and I believe this was in Florida, several years ago, and her young daughter, who I believe was about 3 years old, disappeared, and nobody could find her. And everybody thought, well, where'd she go? Was she sold into sex slavery? Did someone kidnap her? Is she dead? What's going on? And the mother of the girl, and the mother's name was Casey Anthony, was in her early 20s, I believe. And her story changed a lot. At first, she said that the babysitter kidnapped her daughter, but she didn't tell police that her daughter was kidnapped because she was afraid. And so she did not report this missing daughter for, it was at least a month and maybe more. And she said, well, why didn't... So she finally was confronted by the police. Someone said, where's your daughter? Where's your daughter? Nobody could find her daughter. Her parents didn't know where the daughter was. So finally people said, hey, something's wrong here. This kid's missing. And so the police got involved. She said, oh, the babysitter kidnapped her. That was what she said at first. And then later it came out in court. She said, oh no, that wasn't true. What really happened was my parents had my daughter and she drowned in the pool, in their pool. So it was their fault. And they said, okay, well, still, why didn't you call the police? And she said, well, I was afraid. I was afraid to call the police because I thought they would blame me. So that was her story. Now let me ask you this. And later, by the way, during the trial, they found her daughter's body wrapped up in a plastic bag with duct tape over the little girl's mouth in the woods not far from where this young mom lived. And it looked like she'd been dead for months. So what's the story here? Does this sound probable? Is her story coherent? Does it hang together? Does it seem likely? Or are there holes in it? Are there gaps in it? A lot of people said, well, that just does... Literally, they said that doesn't add up. Why would you do that? Why didn't you call the police? Your daughter. Why did you say that the babysitter took her? And that wasn't true. Oh, I was nervous. Okay, why did you not tell the police that your daughter died, or why didn't you call the ambulance when your daughter had drowned? Oh, I was nervous. what were you nervous about? What's going on here? And, they never put her on the stand. It was just, I don't believe they ever put her on the stand. I think it was just explanations through the lawyer about what happened. And also, fidelity. Does this ring true about how a mother of a child would act? If a babysitter kidnapped your daughter, how do mothers react? Did they get afraid and not call the cops? Or would they call the police? Would they get other people involved? And if not the cops, why not at least involve other family members or something? I mean, does it ring true with what we understand about motherhood and how people act? So obviously, I'm leaning toward it. You can tell by the way I'm telling the story that this does not resonate with what we normally think of as how people act. Especially moms, wouldn't act this way. This sounds like something a crazy person would say. It just doesn't add up. We haven't even looked at the evidence, right? We haven't done ethos, pathos, logos, but there's obviously something wrong with this story. And so the defense, even though the defense doesn't know exactly what happened because they don't have eyewitnesses, they pieced together their own version of what they thought happened, and that is that the mother, the young mom, who was a well-known partier and was seen partying hard, entering bikini contests at nightclubs and things like this, in the days after they figured out, the immediate days after her daughter was dead, here's what the defense think happened. She wanted to go out, and her daughter, and she didn't have a babysitter perhaps, and her daughter was crying and asleep, so she gave her a heavy dose of medication that would make her go to sleep so that she could go out and party. The dose was too high, and it killed her. She may have also duct taped her mouth to try to keep her from screaming and quieting down because she didn't want to hear her. She may have medicated her and duct taped her mouth. So she died, and the prosecuting attorney said, hey, maybe that's an accidental death, whatever, but it still was a death, and you should have reported it. So that's the two stories. Which one sounds more reasonable to you? Which one sounds more probable? Which one sounds like it has more fidelity? So the narrative paradigm is it contrasts with the traditional argumentative rhetorical approach, ethos, pathos, logos. So those are some rhetorical traditions under the area of messages, and the narrative paradigm is a lot about how we evaluate the messages that we hear.